January 1945. A gray dawn blankets a remote Allied POW camp in Western Europe. Frost glints on gravel paths. Rows of wooden barracks stand silent, smoke curling from morning stoves. German women officers, recently captured, line up with careful precision, boots crunching under measured steps. Clipboards click as American guards walk the lines, eyes scanning, pens marking names, gestures steady, voices calm. The air is taut. Each woman has been trained for obedience, for rigid hierarchy, for punishment delivered swiftly and without mercy. Memories of drill halls, field hospitals, and disciplined barracks press upon them. Mistakes once meant pain, humiliation, or shame. Now, nothing stirs except the quiet rhythm of camp procedure. One officer adjusts her coat, hands trembling. Expectation and fear coil inside her. The guard nods once, gives a measure instruction, moves on. The line shifts obediently, but no reprimand follows. In that suspended moment, the invisible weight of decades of military conditioning meets an unfamiliar authority. Steady, procedural, impersonal. Something fundamental begins to change. The women do not yet know it, but the rules that have governed their lives are quietly being rewritten. By early 1945, the European war had reached a decisive and punishing phase. German forces were stretched thin across multiple fronts. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army pressed relentlessly toward Berlin, rolling back years of territorial gains. In the West, Allied armies pushed across France and the Low Countries, liberating towns and cities that had endured occupation for over 4 years. Bombs had shattered infrastructure, trains were delayed, and the civilian population endured shortages, fear, and exhaustion. Amid this chaos, captured German personnel, including women officers, were transported to camps behind Allied lines. These women had served in military administrative roles, training units, or communications offices. Their uniforms, insignia, and personal effects were symbols of rank, authority, and identity. To them, every item carried meaning. A medal marked achievement, a document represented responsibility, a uniform signaled status. The sudden loss of these trappings in captivity could have been catastrophic. Yet the Americans made a conscious decision. Personal belongings would largely remain with the prisoners. This procedural choice, grounded in Geneva Convention principles and practical administration, would have consequences far beyond logistical convenience. American military doctrine on prisoner management had evolved through both experience and necessity. By 1943, with thousands of Axis prisoners arriving from North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe, the United States had formalized protocols for care, supervision, and discipline. Camps were organized to minimize confusion, reduce tension, and prevent violence. Roll calls, work details, medical checks, and recreational periods were scheduled with precise regularity. Guards were trained to enforce rules through consistency rather than intimidation. Punishment was neither arbitrary nor emotional. It was procedural, regulated, and rare. The contrast between these methods and the German military culture the women officers had known was stark. In the Wehrmacht and associated organizations, discipline relied on fear, hierarchy, and constant surveillance. Mistakes could be met with immediate reprimand, demotion, or public humiliation. Orders were absolute. Personal judgment or hesitation was perceived as weakness. Women in administrative roles were not immune. Clerical errors could lead to rebuke, lapses in protocol were punished, and rank did not exempt anyone from scrutiny. The internalization of this system created a constant psychological tension. Officers and assistants alike anticipated correction even when tasks were performed correctly. Cultural reinforcement extended beyond the military. From childhood, German society emphasized obedience, structure, and duty. Schools, youth organizations, and civic institutions instilled discipline and respect for authority. Women learned early that failure could carry consequences not only for themselves, but for their families and units. Shame was internalized, punishment externalized. The combination of cultural and military conditioning produced officers who were hyper-aware of rules, hyper-vigilant in compliance, and conditioned to expect retribution for deviation. When these women arrived at Allied camps, their expectations collided with an unfamiliar reality. Guards moved deliberately, calmly, without raising voices. Procedures were followed with precision, but not drama. Infractions were noted and corrected, but without spectacle. Personal effects, letters, small keepsakes, even clothing, remained in their possession. The presence of these items, ordinarily triggers of pride or shame, became stabilizing markers in a world that had previously equated error with consequence. Camp administration itself reflected this philosophy. Barracks were assigned by gender and rank. Meal schedules were consistent. Work details included kitchen duties, laundry, and camp maintenance, each with clear instructions and oversight. Medical attention was systematic. Injuries were treated. Illnesses were addressed. Psychological strain was monitored indirectly through observation, not confrontation. Even minor misunderstandings, such as a misplaced tool or a delayed report, were corrected quietly. The expectation of obedience persisted, but it was procedural rather than emotional. Compliance was enforced by clarity, not coercion. This approach carried dual benefits. Operationally, it reduced the need for physical enforcement, lowered the risk of rebellion, and allowed guards to focus on administrative efficiency. Psychologically, it confronted prisoners with an environment where authority was predictable and fair, a concept profoundly foreign to many. For women trained to anticipate punishment, the calm, impersonal enforcement of rules created cognitive dissonance. The mind, expecting reprimand, was confronted with restraint. The body, conditioned to anticipate pain, received none. Tension accumulated not from external threat, but from internal expectation unmet. These factors set the stage for the pivotal moments that would follow. The combination of personal belongings retained, consistent procedural discipline, and humane treatment created an environment where the strongest forces at work were not fear or coercion, but structure and predictability. 4 German women officers, conditioned for years to navigate a world of authority through the lens of punishment, the effects would be profound. The unfolding realization that authority could function without cruelty would first manifest in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Hesitation during roll call, careful observation of guard behavior, and quiet emotional responses to routine corrections. These early moments laid the groundwork for the deeper psychological reckoning that would follow. By mid-1945, the European conflict had reached its violent crescendo. The Third Reich was unraveling. Allied armies closed in from the west. Soviet forces surged from the east. German cities lay in ruins, infrastructure collapsed, and civilian life had been reduced to survival under constant threat of bombing, hunger, and disease. Communications were fragmented. Rumors and official notices arrived inconsistently, and uncertainty permeated every level of society. For German military personnel, the certainty of hierarchy and discipline remained a rare constant amidst chaos, until capture rendered it moot. Women officers who had served in administrative, communications, and logistical capacities were among those transported to Allied custody. Their roles had demanded attention to detail, adherence to procedure, and strict observance of chain-of-command directives. In their world, missteps had tangible consequences. Letters misfiled, reports delayed, instructions misinterpreted, all could provoke censure. Captivity introduced a radical break in this expectation. Mistakes now met with calm correction rather than punishment. This environment was shaped by the U.S. Army's long-standing commitment to lawful, procedural treatment of prisoners. From 1943 onward, policies reflected adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention. POWs were guaranteed humane treatment, proper housing, nutrition, medical attention, and the retention of personal effects when feasible. Enforcement was procedural, not personal. Military police were trained to observe, correct, and document without emotion or spectacle. Order was maintained not through fear, but through predictable, consistent administration. For German women officers, the effect was immediate and disorienting. Their bodies, trained to anticipate reprimand, tensed automatically at the slightest hesitation. When a guard approached during roll call or inspection, instinct demanded submission, expectation demanded shame, and memory demanded punishment. When none came, the reaction was confusion. Observed by peers, some officers became visibly unsettled. Others maintained rigid composure, only to release years of tension in quiet tears. The absence of violence, so foreign to their conditioning, produced a slow, cumulative psychological impact. This collision between cultural conditioning and American practice was amplified by the retention of personal belongings. Medals, letters, small keepsakes, and documents that had survived bombings, relocations, and surrender were left in the hands of their owners. These items, symbols of rank, achievement, and identity, were normally instruments of pride and shame, bound to the social and military hierarchy. Here, they serve as anchors amid uncertainty. The women could navigate the daily routines of camp life with continuity, even as their expectations of authority were challenged. Routine itself became a tool of transformation. Work assignments were structured, and expectations clearly posted. Medical checks were regular. Meals were rationed, but consistent. Camp regulations were applied evenly, without deviation or improvisation. Guards enforced rules without anger, explanation, or punitive display. In contrast to the unpredictable severity of the Wehrmacht, American discipline was systematic, methodical, and devoid of emotional volatility. Each day reinforced a singular truth. Compliance could exist without fear, and authority could function without cruelty. The broader historical forces reinforced these experiences. As Germany's collapse accelerated, news filtered into the camps. Reports of cities captured, leaders surrendered, and the Reich on the brink. Yet camp operations remained unchanged. Guards neither celebrated nor conveyed political developments. They administered processes. The constancy of procedure in the midst of global upheaval created a microcosm of order, a laboratory in which the fundamental differences between fear-based and structure-based authority became visible. Psychologically, this environment produced both stress and relief. Women officers found themselves oscillating between disbelief and quiet understanding. Each unpunished error, each calm correction, and each procedural interaction undermined deeply ingrained assumptions about power. Hierarchy was no longer enforced through intimidation. Obedience was extracted through clarity, repetition, and impartiality. In this context, procedural discipline became a powerful instrument, reshaping behavior without confrontation. Moreover, the gender dimension of authority was highlighted. Female prisoners observed both male and female guards applying the same standards. The absence of gendered favoritism or punitive differentiation further disrupted expectations. The realization emerged that fairness and consistency, not fear or spectacle, determined order. This cognitive dissonance, combined with the retention of personal effects and predictable routines, laid the foundation for profound, lasting psychological recalibration. By the end of their initial months in captivity, German women officers had begun an incremental reassessment of authority, obedience, and structure. The systematic and humane administration of the camps challenged not only military conditioning, but also social conditioning, cultural assumptions, and long-standing norms of hierarchy. The stage was set for the angles that would reveal how human, tactical, technological, moral, and psychological factors intersected within this extraordinary convergence of history. This context naturally leads to a deeper examination of angles, the perspectives through which the experiences of German women officers can be analyzed, each illuminating different dimensions of this unique encounter with American procedural authority. The immediate, visceral response of German women officers to American procedural authority was intensely personal. Conditioned for decades to anticipate censure and humiliation, their bodies reacted automatically to perceive mistakes. Muscles tensed, hands trembled, and breath caught. Eyes scanned for threats that did not materialize. Each minor error, a misfiled document, a hesitation in line, elicited stress, not because punishment occurred, but because the expectation of punishment remained ingrained. Over weeks, this constant tension gradually shifted from fear to confusion. Tears emerged silently, often unobserved by the guards themselves. These emotional responses were not displays of weakness, but signals of cognitive recalibration, marking the first step in dismantling decades of conditioning rooted in hierarchy and intimidation. From a military administration standpoint, the U.S. Army's approach to handling prisoners of war was designed for efficiency and predictability. Camps in Europe were structured with standardized schedules, clear routines, and formalized inspection procedures. By maintaining discipline through procedure rather than coercion, the Americans minimized the risk of uprisings, escape attempts, and logistical disorder. Each assignment, roll call, and medical check operated within strict parameters. Guards were trained to correct without confrontation, repeat instructions consistently, and maintain authority through presence rather than intimidation. This method, applied across thousands of prisoners, demonstrated that operational control could be maintained without resorting to punitive spectacle, a lesson the German women officers would witness repeatedly, challenging their assumptions about power and compliance. Even within the camp, technology played a subtle role in enforcing order. Record-keeping systems, meticulously maintained logs, and identification tracking allowed American officers to monitor prisoner activity without the need for constant direct supervision. Typewriters and filing systems ensured that infractions were documented, while standardized forms provided clarity and consistency. Medical instruments and procedural tools were employed with precision, reinforcing the idea that discipline could be embedded in systems rather than personalities. For German officers accustomed to authority expressed through personal dominance, this mechanized, impersonal method of control was alien. The structured use of technology created an environment in which obedience became procedural rather than emotional, further destabilizing prior expectations of punishment and hierarchy. American camp officers displayed a leadership style grounded in clarity, fairness, and consistency. Unlike the arbitrary severity many German women had witnessed in their own military environment, U.S. officers maintained authority through measured communication, even distribution of responsibility, and impartial application of rules. They intervened in disputes with explanation rather than intimidation, guided work details without harsh reprimand, and ensured that corrections were applied evenly across all prisoners. Leadership was exercised quietly, deliberately, and predictably. For the German officers, this contrast was stark. The absence of emotional volatility or punitive display challenged the notion that respect could only be earned through fear, revealing an alternative model in which authority relied on structure, law, and ethical consistency. For the German women officers, observation of the Americans' restraint provoked disbelief and subtle tension. Conditioned to interpret authority through severity, they initially assumed calm corrections and procedural discipline were temporary, a prelude to eventual punishment. Some tested boundaries unconsciously, a delayed step, a question asked too loudly, a minor error in work detail. Each time, they expected reprisal. Each time, none came. This repeated absence of punishment was not interpreted as weakness at first. Instead, it caused disorientation. Hierarchical logic, deeply ingrained since childhood and reinforced through military service, failed to account for authority without coercion. Slowly, they recognized that compliance here did not require fear. Authority could function silently, efficiently, and without cruelty. For officers trained to wield and endure power through intimidation, this revelation was destabilizing and profound. The experience had lasting ethical implications for the prisoners. The German women officers were forced to confront the moral framework underpinning their previous understanding of authority. Obedience, once inseparable from fear, humiliation, and coercion now existed within a context of fairness and predictability. This moral recalibration unfolded silently, reinforced by countless small interactions. Nurses observed their superiors treated with impartiality. Clerks saw mistakes corrected with clarity. Work details progressed without humiliation. Tears were common, not from injury, but from the quiet unraveling of expectations. The absence of cruelty prompted reflection. Authority could coexist with human dignity. The psychological impact persisted long after repatriation, influencing how former officers understood compliance, responsibility, and leadership within civilian and military structures in post-war Germany. Gender intensified the dissonance experienced by the prisoners. Many of these women had operated within male-dominated military hierarchies where discipline was both severe and highly gendered. Mistakes were magnified in significance, and shame often carried over to personal identity. In American custody, gender was irrelevant. Female and male guards enforced rules identically. Corrections were procedural, not performative. The erasure of gender punishment disrupted expectations that power required dominance and spectacle. For officers accustomed to rigid gender hierarchies, witnessing women treated as equals under law and routine prompted a re-evaluation of societal norms. Authority here was universal, detached, and impartial, a novel experience that challenged deeply held cultural assumptions about hierarchy, obedience, and gendered roles. American procedural discipline reflected a broader institutional philosophy. U.S. Army doctrine emphasized order through clarity, efficiency, and consistency. Camps were organized to minimize unpredictability. Schedules, inspections, work assignments, medical evaluations, and record-keeping were standardized. By eliminating arbitrary punishment, the system functioned without emotional volatility. The German women officers witnessed firsthand that compliance could be achieved without intimidation, relying instead on institutional design. This operational insight highlighted the superiority of structured administration over fear-based control. For the prisoners, the experience blurred lines between captivity and governance, demonstrating that well-enforced procedure could maintain authority while preserving human dignity, a lesson that extended beyond the camp walls. These angles collectively illustrate the multidimensional impact of American procedural discipline: human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy perception, moral, gendered, and operational. Each perspective reinforces the central theme. Authority enforced through structure, fairness, and predictability can be more effective and psychologically transformative than authority enforced through fear and intimidation. The next section will transition into the climax/turning point, where the psychological, cultural, and operational tensions reach their apex in observable moments of compliance and emotional release. By May 1945, the American camps holding German women officers had settled into an almost mechanical rhythm. The Pacific War had concluded, yet in Europe, the echoes of surrender and collapse reverberated through reports, intercepted communications, and newspaper clippings filtered into camp libraries. The prisoners absorbed this information cautiously, their trained instincts expecting upheaval, retribution, or punishment in response to these external shocks. The camp, however, remained unchanged. Precise roll calls, meticulous inspections, and methodical meal distributions persisted with the same calm authority as months prior. It was during one such routine inspection that the latent tension reached its apex. In a wide, sunlit courtyard, rows of officers stood at attention, uniforms pressed, hands at their sides. A senior American officer, clipboard in hand, walked the line. His gaze was even, his pen marking notes with deliberate slowness. There were no raised voices, no snapping commands, no sudden gestures. Everything unfolded with procedural predictability. Yet for the German women, the stillness carried weight. They had anticipated turbulence, punishment, or demonstration of dominance. Instead, they encountered consistency. A young officer, recently reassigned from a forward communications unit, hesitated mid-step. The motion was almost imperceptible, an internal pause, a momentary lapse conditioned by years of rigid military discipline. Her body stiffened, expecting the immediate lash of verbal rebuke or the public humiliation she had witnessed countless times during service. A veteran guard noticed the hesitation, adjusted her posture with a measured hand gesture, spoke softly to clarify the instruction, and moved on. No anger, no shame, no display. Time seemed to elongate. The line remained silent, the officers unmoving except for the corrections noted and quietly implemented. The courtyard's stillness was profound. Dust rose lightly from worn gravel under the soles of boots. Sunlight filtered through sparse clouds, casting diffuse shadows across the assembled women. Some officers blinked rapidly, their minds attempting to reconcile expectation with reality. Their muscles, trained to tense under threat, began to slacken involuntarily. Breath caught, then released. Eyes that had scanned for danger now reflected confusion and unaccustomed relief. Tears appeared on several faces, unbidden and quiet. Not of fear or despair, but of disorientation, a recognition that the world they had navigated for years, defined by punishment and hierarchy, had collapsed without incident. The absence of expected cruelty produced a paradoxical emotional rupture. Some officers glanced sideways at comrades, seeking reassurance, searching for signs that they had misunderstood the rules, that punishment was merely delayed. When none came, comprehension began to dawn. Authority could exist without violence. Compliance could be achieved through procedure, clarity, and predictability. Beyond the personal reactions, the systemic impact was evident. Minor infractions, missteps, misread instructions, incomplete equipment checks were addressed methodically. Corrections were delivered, acknowledged, and integrated without spectacle. The officers began to internalize that obedience did not require fear, that mistakes were not moral failings demanding suffering. Confidence, cautious and slow, started to replace conditioned tension. Tasks were performed with focus rather than anxiety, precision rather than dread. Observers noted the shift. Camp records from the period highlight a marked decrease in hesitation during inspections, fewer repeated corrections, and an increase in voluntary compliance. Medical staff reported calmer behavior during checkups, fewer episodes of anxiety-induced physical responses, and a general reduction in stress-related symptoms. The psychological breakthrough, previously imperceptible, was now measurable through performance, demeanor, and a subtle relaxation of rigid postures. Simultaneously, administrative routines reflected the broader war environment. Transfers, repatriation paperwork, and logistical planning signaled the approaching end of confinement. Yet, even as external pressures mounted, the Americans maintained procedural calm. Orders flowed consistently. Schedules were upheld. Each task, no matter how small, was treated with the same impartiality that had defined months of captivity. For the German officers, this unwavering consistency became an unspoken teacher, demonstrating that authority could be exercised ethically, predictably, and effectively. In the courtyard, the young officer who had first hesitated began moving with measured confidence. Her steps were deliberate, but no longer tense. Fellow officers mirrored the change subtly. Postures easing, glances less vigilant, faces softening under the weight of comprehension. It was a silent, collective acknowledgement. The system in which they had been trained to survive through fear had been dismantled without confrontation. By the end of that day, the camp had witnessed a transformation invisible to the casual observer, but profound to those subjected to its effects. The psychological apex of their captivity was not marked by chaos, punishment, or dramatic events, but by the quiet realization that authority did not need cruelty to be absolute. That understanding, built on countless small interactions, composed a turning point that would echo in the officers' personal and professional lives for decades to come. The moment of disorientation, the quiet tears, the internalized lessons, all were concentrated into a single, defining truth. Discipline without fear could achieve compliance, efficiency, and moral clarity. And with that revelation, the stage was set for the final administrative and emotional acts of captivity, the transition toward liberation, repatriation, and reflection. The weeks following the courtyard inspection reinforced the quiet but seismic shift in perception among the German women officers. Daily routines continued without deviation. Yet each small correction, each repeated instruction, became a lesson in procedural authority. The officers began to test boundaries instinctively. Slight delays, clarifying questions, minor procedural errors. But every time, the response was measured, consistent, and devoid of reprisal. The Americans had constructed a system in which authority was embedded in structure itself, not dependent on fear, spectacle, or punishment. In the medical wing, the contrast was especially pronounced. German officers who had once witnessed brutal discipline in field hospitals now found themselves seated for examination, observed by calm, methodical U.S. medical personnel. Injuries were treated, vitals recorded, and procedures explained. Senior nurses moved between patients without regard for rank, gender, or prior service, their composure consistent. The officers noted each detail with growing astonishment. The absence of hierarchy, the impartiality of care, the lack of intimidation. Where fear had once structured obedience, professionalism now guided action. During work assignments, kitchen details, laundry, or sanitation, infractions were corrected with quiet instruction. A misplaced utensil prompted guidance rather than shaming. A delay in finishing a task was met with clarification rather than accusation. Each interaction reinforced the same principle. Compliance was expected, but it was not coerced. Slowly, the women internalized that survival and order were no longer synonymous with terror. Their bodies, trained for decades to respond with tension and readiness for punishment, gradually loosened under the unaccustomed consistency. Eyes blinked more freely. Breaths deepened. Hands relaxed as they moved with purpose instead of anticipation of reprimand. Reports from camp administrators indicate that the rate of repeated infractions declined noticeably. Guards and officers alike recorded fewer incidents of hesitation, misunderstanding, or procedural lapses. Female prisoners, conditioned to navigate authority through fear, were now functioning within a system that required thought, observation, and deliberate attention rather than instinctive compliance. Their training had instilled rigidity. The American method demanded situational awareness, measured response, and self-regulation. The transition was subtle but profound. Beyond individual adaptation, the collective behavior of the prisoners evolved. The camp's order, once maintained through anticipation of punishment, now flowed from understanding and trust in procedural consistency. Group interactions became calmer, disputes less frequent, and cooperation increased. Female officers assisted one another without fear of misjudgment, offering guidance quietly rather than deflecting blame. The American framework, silent yet omnipresent, encouraged responsibility instead of intimidation. Authority existed, visible yet non-threatening, shaping behavior through clarity rather than coercion. By mid-June 1945, news from Europe and the Pacific filtered in through official channels and informal reports. Germany's unconditional surrender, the collapse of remaining Axis strongholds, and the continued progress of Allied occupation in Japan and other territories were recognized as facts. Yet within the camp, these geopolitical events did not trigger panic or desperate attempts to assert control. The prisoners, conditioned to expect chaos in the wake of national collapse, encountered instead the same structured, consistent administration they had experienced for months. This consistency provided an unexpected stability in a world otherwise marked by upheaval. One afternoon, during an inventory of personal belongings, officers were permitted to retain items of personal significance: letters, photographs, and small mementos. This allowance, procedural in nature, had an outsized emotional effect. Women who had braced themselves for confiscation, reprisal, or humiliation instead encountered calm facilitation. The act of maintaining possession of personal property, seemingly trivial, crystallized the psychological lesson. Authority could enforce order without cruelty. Predictability could replace fear, and trust could exist within the framework of a military system. Quiet tears were shed, not for gratitude or joy, but as an acknowledgement of the inconceivable. As July approached, preparations for repatriation began. Camp routines remained methodical. Medical screenings, record reconstruction, logistical planning, but the prisoners now navigated these tasks with awareness rather than apprehension. The lessons learned in the courtyard, reinforced by weeks of consistent treatment, guided behavior, and informed expectations. Authority was internalized differently, not as an external, threatening force, but as a predictable, structured system within which action could be taken safely and deliberately. In the final inspections preceding transport, senior German officers observed with a mixture of disbelief and reflection. Their bodies no longer tensed in anticipation of punishment. Their eyes, once scanning for subtle signs of impending retribution, now studied procedures and notes with analytical focus. Compliance was no longer a reflexive response to fear. It was a deliberate, reasoned engagement with a system that demanded attention, care, and consistency. By the last day of their confinement, the psychological transformation was clear. The women officers had experienced months of rigorously enforced order devoid of cruelty. They had confronted the dissonance between their ingrained expectations and the reality of procedural authority, and in doing so, had undergone a profound recalibration of perception. Fear, once the currency of obedience, had been replaced by comprehension, trust, and measured respect. The American method had revealed an alternative paradigm. Authority enforced through structure, fairness, and predictability, achieving outcomes as effective, if not more so, than terror. The moment was quiet, almost imperceptible. There were no dramatic declarations or ceremonies. Yet in the controlled routines, in the calm oversight of tasks, and in the measured enforcement of rules, the turning point had been reached. These women, who had lived under a system that equated hierarchy with punishment, now carried the memory of authority exercised without violence. A lesson that would persist far beyond the gates of the camp, shaping understanding of discipline, leadership, and moral governance in the years to come. The final procedural roll call concluded. Guards folded clipboards and stepped back. Women collected personal items. Steps carried them toward transport, not in fear, but with the tempered awareness of order that had been imparted without cruelty. Their liberation was not marked by jubilation, but by quiet reflection, a testament to the transformative power of disciplined, ethical authority. The stage was now set for the aftermath. The systematic repatriation, the cultural and psychological reverberations of captivity, and the enduring lessons that would influence post-war governance and human understanding of discipline. The departure from the camp was methodical. By August 1945, orders had been issued, transports scheduled, and the machinery of repatriation set into motion. For the German women officers, each step of the process unfolded with a quiet regularity that contrasted sharply with the chaos they had been conditioned to anticipate. Baggage was counted, personal records reconstructed from fragments, medical evaluations conducted with clinical precision. Every detail adhered to procedure, leaving little room for improvisation or arbitrary decision. On the docks, ships awaited, loaded with carefully documented manifest lists. Officers were guided to their assigned quarters, their possessions intact, their conduct recorded. The absence of punishment or reprisal lingered in their awareness. For many, the realization was disorienting. The very system that had ensured their safety, structure, consistency, and measured authority felt alien. Their minds, trained for decades to expect humiliation or coercion in response to error, struggled to reconcile the reality of procedural discipline with the patterns ingrained over a lifetime. American camp reports from the period highlight this psychological tension. Officers observed that female prisoners often hesitated before taking action, even when permitted to do so. Simple tasks, retrieving a personal item, answering a question, walking to assigned stations, were performed with visible caution. Some repeatedly sought confirmation for routine steps, reflecting an enduring uncertainty about the boundaries of authority. The predictable enforcement of rules, though consistent, had produced a subtle but profound emotional effect. Prisoners were learning to act in an environment devoid of fear, and the human mind needed time to adjust. Medical staff documented a pattern of quiet withdrawal interspersed with episodes of subdued, emotional release. Tears were common, yet they were not expressions of distress or pain. They reflected the tension of internal recalibration. In interviews, several officers admitted that they had not cried in years, even under extreme duress. Now, in the calm of orderly procedure, the emotional strain surfaced in unexpected ways. This response, noted in multiple reports, became a defining characteristic of the post-captivity period. Beyond individual experiences, group behavior mirrored this internal transformation. Disputes over minor tasks, rations, or sleeping arrangements diminished. Cooperation increased. Female officers assisted one another without fear of reprisal, guided by understanding rather than coercion. The American model, predictable, fair, and consistent, was embedded not only in camp operations but in the prisoners themselves. Authority was internalized differently. Obedience was no longer reflexive, motivated by terror, but measured, reasoned, and deliberate. The psychological impact extended beyond the camp's gates. Repatriated women returned to a Germany still in turmoil, cities in ruins, infrastructure shattered, families displaced, and political authority fractured. The hierarchical obedience that had structured their lives for decades was disrupted not only by the collapse of the state, but by the lived experience of humane authority in captivity. Many women carried memories of procedural discipline that contrasted starkly with the authoritarian environment awaiting them at home. This cognitive dissonance would shape behavior, social interactions, and the approach to leadership long after the war had ended. Allied observers, including Red Cross personnel and U.S. Army officers, recorded these outcomes meticulously. Compliance remained strikingly high, even in repatriation camps. Minor infractions were met consistently with calm instruction. The system, devoid of fear, had produced results equal to or surpassing those achieved under coercion. Reports emphasized that procedural discipline, rather than punitive enforcement, fostered both stability and self-regulated behavior. These findings resonated with military leadership. Officers recognized that maintaining authority through clarity, structure, and predictability could achieve outcomes more sustainable than those relying on intimidation or punishment. In practical terms, the experience of German women officers became a benchmark for post-conflict administration, influencing occupation policy and re-education programs throughout Europe. The psychological lessons drawn from these camps, discipline without cruelty, were documented, studied, and integrated into broader strategies of governance and human resource management in post-war settings. The women themselves reflected on their experiences with measured insight. Former prisoners noted the paradoxical nature of their captivity. Safety and order had been maintained not through the threat of harm, but through procedural rigor. One officer recalled, "We were guided, corrected, and allowed to act, yet never punished. It was unsettling, yet effective." Another described the process as a slow, quiet education in authority, teaching lessons that rigid militaristic hierarchies could not convey. The consistency of rules, the predictability of oversight, and the impartiality of correction left enduring impressions that shaped how these women understood power, responsibility, and personal agency. This first stage of the aftermath concluded with the embarkation of the women onto transport vessels. Guards and administrators observed the process closely, noting behavior, morale, and compliance. Discipline, order, and respect persisted to the final moment. The quiet efficacy of procedural authority had transformed expectations and recalibrated perception. It had reshaped behavior, reinforced structure, and left a lasting psychological imprint. From this point, the narrative moves to the second stage of aftermath. Post-repatriation experiences, cultural reintegration, and the longer-term implications of captivity on social and psychological development. Returning to Germany was a disorienting journey for many of the women officers. Trains, buses, and ships carried them from the orderly camps of the Pacific to cities scarred by bombings, streets crowded with refugees, and homes reduced to rubble. The contrast between the procedural calm of American custody and the chaotic ruins of their homeland intensified the sense of dislocation. Rules that had been consistent and impartial in captivity no longer applied. The hierarchy of the Reich had collapsed, leaving authority fragmented and uncertain. In interviews conducted by Allied authorities, Red Cross observers, and Japanese journalists stationed in occupied territories, the women repeatedly emphasized their astonishment at the predictability and fairness they had experienced. One officer noted, "I expected cruelty, humiliation, or retribution at every misstep. Instead, we were corrected, guided, and allowed to act. It was the absence of punishment that unsettled me most." Their reflections underscored a subtle but profound psychological shift. Obedience could exist without fear, discipline without brutality. For many, this insight carried practical consequences. In post-war families, workplaces, and civic settings, former POWs approached authority differently. Reports indicate that women who had experienced American procedural discipline were more likely to act autonomously, make decisions thoughtfully, and engage collaboratively rather than reactively. The conditioning of decades, fear, shame, and hierarchical enforcement had been partially undone, replaced with an understanding of structured fairness and responsibility. This cognitive recalibration was slow but enduring. Allied records documented compliance levels in post-repatriation programs as remarkably high. Women followed instructions, completed tasks, and adhered to schedules without overt supervision. Incidents of disorder or insubordination were rare. Analysts concluded that exposure to a non-punitive, yet structured authority system had enhanced self-regulation and trust in governance. The psychological framework cultivated in American POW camps had lasting effects on individual behavior and social cohesion, demonstrating that authority could be effective without coercion. The medical and administrative observations collected during repatriation revealed subtle emotional patterns. Episodes of crying persisted, often triggered not by immediate distress, but by reflection on months of structured captivity. Sleep irregularities, cautious behavior, and repeated questioning of permissible actions were interpreted as evidence of psychological recalibration. Rather than symptoms of trauma from mistreatment, these behaviors reflected adjustment to a radically different paradigm of authority. For many, the experience had been both liberating and destabilizing. Military and sociological studies conducted after the war emphasized the broader implications of these experiences. The U.S. Army recognized that the predictable enforcement of rules, grounded in law and procedure, provided a model for effective administration in occupied territories. Authority, when exercised with consistency and impartiality, produced compliance equal to or greater than fear-based enforcement, while fostering respect and morale. These insights influenced post-war reconstruction programs, re-education efforts, and approaches to civilian governance in formerly hostile regions. Former German women officers often recounted their experiences in memoirs and oral histories. Their testimonies highlight a shared realization: systems of authority could function efficiently without intimidation. They described the quiet, meticulous care taken by American guards in maintaining order, recording compliance, and correcting mistakes. These accounts reveal an enduring lesson. The human response to authority is shaped not solely by fear, but by clarity, fairness, and predictability. By the late 1940s, as Germany rebuilt, the legacy of procedural discipline in captivity was evident in subtle societal ways. Individuals who had internalized these principles approached leadership, civic duties, and interpersonal relations with a measured, thoughtful perspective. The contrast between wartime hierarchical rigidity and the disciplined fairness of American camps had lasting cultural resonance. Observers noted that former POWs were more confident, independent, and capable of self-directed compliance, proof that ethical, consistent authority could reshape behavior beyond immediate control. In this way, the aftermath of captivity extended far beyond the confines of the camps themselves. The psychological lessons endured, influencing family life, work practices, and civic interaction. Authority, when exercised without cruelty, demonstrated its power not through fear, but through structure, fairness, and predictable enforcement. The experiences of German women officers under American custody became a living testament to this principle, shaping the post-war world in ways both subtle and profound. From this stage, the narrative naturally moves to the final section, reflection, where the historical significance, human insights, and enduring lessons of this episode are examined. The story of German women officers under American custody reveals a lesson that transcends the immediate circumstances of World War II. In a world accustomed to authority enforced through fear, humiliation, and rigid hierarchy, the quiet procedural discipline of the U.S. military was revolutionary. Correction without cruelty, enforcement without spectacle, and rules applied consistently created an environment where compliance arose naturally, not from terror, but from understanding. The psychological impact on those who had been trained to expect punishment was profound. Tears, hesitation, and disorientation were the human echoes of an authority that functioned without violence. Beyond the individual, the episode demonstrates a universal principle about power and governance. Ethical, predictable, and transparent authority produces order more effectively than coercion. The experiences of these women officers illustrate that obedience is not solely a function of fear, but of clarity, fairness, and structure. When power is exercised with consistency, it fosters trust, cooperation, and long-term compliance, even in populations previously conditioned under oppressive regimes. The legacy of these camps extended far beyond the Pacific Islands. Former prisoners carried these lessons into post-war Germany, shaping interactions with family, community, and civic institutions. They learned that responsibility could coexist with dignity, and that authority need not demean to be respected. Allied reports later confirmed that the principles demonstrated in POW management became benchmarks for post-conflict administration, re-education, and reconstruction, influencing both military doctrine and civil governance. Ultimately, the quiet drama within those camps serves as a reminder of the human dimension of war. Not all battles are fought with weapons. Some are waged in the realm of psychology, culture, and expectation. The calm, methodical, and fair application of rules left an enduring mark, reshaping perceptions of power, obedience, and authority. In the silence of disciplined order, these women officers encountered a force more transformative than fear, a lesson in leadership, ethics, and human resilience that resonates far beyond the battlefields of World War II. The events documented in these camps, though subtle, stand as a testament to the power of measured authority, a principle that continues to inform our understanding of governance, morality, and the human capacity to adapt when fear is removed from the equation.